Hi, good evening. Um, I'm thrilled to welcome you to tonight's program, sponsored by the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory in celebration of Jason Francisco's beautiful new book of photography. I'm going to sort of explain a couple things and then introduce our speakers and then hand it over. But the TAM Institute, as you may know, is an interdisciplinary program at Emory committed to the exploration of the Jewish past, the Jewish civilization and Jewish culture. And we're really thrilled to be able to celebrating the publication of Jason's new book. The TAM Institute's commitment to interdisciplinarity is evident through the extensive list of co-sponsors for tonight's program, including Emory Arts, the Department of Film and Media Studies, the Department of German Studies, the Department of History, Religion, and Russian and East Asian languages and cultures. So a real spectrum of our community tonight. And I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce both Jason Francisco and Kevin Karnes to be able to have this conversation about Jason's book. Jason is an associate professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies and affiliated faculty for the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies. Jason is an artist and an essayist, joining documentary and conceptual art. His photo works and writings focus on the complications of historical memory and new directions in the art of witness. And much of his work concerns the inheritance of trauma, specifically concerning Jewish experience in Eastern Europe. And so we're thrilled to be celebrating the publication of Alive and Destroyed, a meditation on the Holocaust in time. Jason will be in conversation tonight with Professor Kevin Karnes, well, actually Associate Dean Kevin Karnes, who is also a professor of music history at Emory, whose own research is in musicology, studying sounding expressions of identity, difference, and belonging in Eastern and Central Europe from the 19th century through to the present. He's the author most recently of Sounds Beyond Our Part in the 1970s Soviet Underground, published this past year. And in his role as Dean of the Arts at Emory, working across campus to connect individuals and groups through artistic work and the conversations that it sparked, Kevin's just a particularly apt person to have a conversation with Jason tonight. So our program will proceed for the first part, a conversation between Jason and Kevin about this book. And then we'll spend the end of this program opening up the conversation to questions and answers from the audience. So as they're speaking, you can feel free to type a question into the question and answer box. You can click on the Q&A at the very bottom of your screen. So we'll have them for the end of the program. So I think with that, I will turn this over to Jason and Kevin. We're really excited to be able to have this conversation.
Thanks, Kate. And hi, Jason.
Hi, Kevin.
It's good to see you. Congratulations on the publication of your incredibly powerful and beautiful book.
Thank you.
For those of us who haven't seen it yet in person, Alive and Destroyed takes us on a kind of photographic journey through a remarkable series of beautiful, haunted, and haunting landscapes that together trace a path through what the historian Timothy Snyder calls the Bloodlands. That is, those places, many, even most of which lying behind the former Iron Curtain, that were once home to millions of Europe's Jews, but where few Jewish people live today. Jason, can you share with us something of your work on the book? In particular, how you found your project and your geographies, and how you go about creating your art?
Sure, yes. I've prepared a set of slides to show you. I think that's the best, most direct way to do that. Let me share my screen. All right, is that visible? Yes, okay, good. All right. So it might be useful to begin just with a little bit of historical background. briefly. In 2013, many of you will know that the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum released a report that gave the result of a 7-year study in which the museum simply tried to count up the number of places where what we call the Holocaust, where the many, many events that we together call the Holocaust occurred. When they began the project, they thought they had a pretty complete count. At the end of the work, they were shocked to discover that they were nowhere near correct in what they imagined at the beginning. From around 6,000 sites, they eventually counted more than 42,000 sites dispersed across the entire geography of occupied Europe. And so when my own place begins with a recognition of the scale and the scope of this genocide, the expansiveness, the extensiveness of it. This map shows a tiny kind of rendering of what it might look like if we were to write in many, many of those names. Broadly speaking, the Holocaust now is understood to have occurred in more or less two distinct forms: the physical destruction of the Jewish people. The one form in the eastern side of German-occupied Europe is often today called the Holocaust by bullets. And this occurred in places where Jews actually lived. These were murders that were conducted by mobile killing squads operating behind the German lines following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. And here is a historical photograph made in the town of Miropil in Ukraine. This is not far from the town of Zhytomyr in central Ukraine. This is precisely, this is a very maybe emblematic representation of this aspect of mass murder in which Germans and Ukrainian militia murdered Jews into pits in or near their own towns. The other major geographic designation is what's now often, by contrast, called the Holocaust by gas, in which millions of people were murdered by asphyxiation in death factories to which they were deported. And in the West, this aspect of the Holocaust is, of course, the best known and the most emblematic. This photograph was made in Auschwitz-Birkenau in the summer of 1944 during the massive deportations of Hungarian Jews. My project, if I were to map it out in a kind of a footprint across the map of Europe, would look something like this. The red area is the pinkish area is German-occupied Europe, and the black line is more or less my geography, a very big geography from basically Riga in the north to Bucharest in the south, and in the west, Berlin, and in the east, Kharkov. So more or less encompassing both sides of the Holocaust's geography. And I've been working, this book took me 10 years to make, and in the course of doing that, many other things also came. And figuring out how to do this book, figuring out, doing the research that was involved in it, and the visual thinking that I found my way to was a years-long process. But maybe to summarize things, or at least by way of a beginning to summarize things, what I found across this geography, I could put in the form maybe of some simple propositions. And I would suggest that what distinguishes this geography, the geography of the Holocaust today, the contemporary geography of the Holocaust, is its paradox, its paradoxical quality. These are locations, as I've written here on the slide, where rupture acquires a kind of agency or force or means or influence. The photograph here is from a village synagogue in southeastern Poland, a very small place, Staryjków. This geography, I think, is also characterized by locations where the urge to remember lacks urgency, or you can say that the need to remember lacks necessity. The photograph here is a picture made in the eastern Galician town of Ivano-Frankivsk, what used to be called Stanisławów. This is the site of a mass Holocaust grave, unmarked, which when I photographed it in 2015 was being built over by a new apartment block. The geography of the Holocaust is filled with locations where historical memory is precisely unresolved. It's something discrepant and conflictual. The picture here shows the Jewish cemetery in the town of Przeworsk in Poland, now a bus station. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know that you're looking at the town's ancient Jewish cemetery. And I would say that it's also characterized by locations where seeing is unreconciled to knowing. The photograph here shows the Jewish cemetery in a small Galician town of called Chodoryv on the Ukrainian side of the border, now a sports field, completely unmarked. All of these photographs, by the way, are included in 2 permanent exhibitions that I made along the way during the years of making Alive and Destroyed, which are at the Galicia Jewish Museum in Kraków in Poland. One of them looks at the geography of the Jewish past on the Polish side of the border, the other one on the Ukrainian side of the border. If any of you in the audience go to Poland, go to Kraków, I would, not just because my work is there, but I would really recommend a visit to the Galicia Jewish Museum. It's a wonderful place. Now, I guess I should step back and just speak briefly about my medium, about photography and the way that I understand it. In a kind of summary form, photography for me is really a kind of intersectional medium. It's a place where many different kinds of inquiries cross: art, science, history, literature, philosophy. All of these take visual form as they pass through photography. This is a sort of predicating way that I understand the medium. Or I guess I could say that photography is the place where seeing and reading cross. We don't really have a good name for this activity, the blending of seeing and reading. There is no word to describe it. And as I've gone further and further in thinking about the nature of my medium itself, I realized that this blending actually has 2 faces. One is a kind of combinational face. You could think of photography as the zone where seeing combines with reading. And the other one is, in a way, the opposite. It's a zone where seeing and reading cancel each other out. And similarly, I guess I could say that photography blends the sense of the enduringness of an illusion, or the sense of conviction on the one side, with a sense of the fugitive nature of truth, or the sense of aporia, the sort of irreconcilable contradiction. And similarly, it's a zone of intersection between testimony and meditation, or the act of capture, or what I might call prehension, and the act of release, or non-grasping. And in this way, it's also a place where memory and remembrance tend to change places. Now, I use lots of cameras, depending on the projects that I'm working on, but in this particular case, my camera was a large format camera, a 19th century style camera. You could say a contemporary 19th century camera. And I used it with an antique lens, or several of them actually. One of them you can see here on the camera. This is about a 100-year-old lens put into a new shutter. And the camera allows a degree, the camera is a large object. It's very slow working. It's very contemplative by nature. And most of all, it allows a kind of plastic control over the look of things. And this turns out to be very valuable if you're interested in making work that has its premise as a kind of intersectional experience through an image. So, for example, just to show you the comparison between what photographs look like with, say, more familiar cameras. This is a picture that I made. Actually, Kevin, I made this when you and I were in Lithuania together in 2018. This town outside of Kaunas, Žiežmariai. This is the synagogue in the interior of Žiežmariai, as made with my Leica, my small handheld camera. And this is the photograph I made with the view camera, the large format camera, in which what's really distinctive about this is, first of all, the nuance of tone, the tonal nuance, because of the sheer size of the negative that's used to make the camera, but also the plastic control over the placement of planes of focus and the shapes of things. With the view camera, you can make planes of focus run really in virtually any direction of space to create a kind of internal dialogue, if you want, between what's inchoate and what's clear, what's blurry, what's sharp, what seems present, what seems less present, what seems to advance in understanding, what seems to recede from understanding. This kind of dialogical approach can be inscribed into the very creation of the image in this sense. Or to give you one more example, this is Babi Yar in Kiev, the site of the famous massacre in September 1941. And the picture on the left is a picture that I made with my Leica. And the picture on the right is the picture that I made with the view camera. Typically, to answer your question, Kevin, my process involved using two cameras, a small camera that I would use kind of as a sketching camera to begin to understand what a place looks like in time, in that moment. And then at a certain moment, I would bring out the big camera, go under the dark cloth. It's on a tripod, and then the contemplative act would begin. Very often, the photographs that I found my way to with the large format camera were pictures I could not entirely foresee until I actually was under the dark cloth looking at the ground glass of the camera. It really took the act of looking to find these pictures. They were not pre-visualizable entirely. So this is something of my method. And let me show you a sequence then of pictures from Alive and Destroyed. I'll show them to you without commentary. You can, insofar as I understand them as experiential in nature, not just informational, but experiential, and we can talk about what that is. I want to show them to you without talk on top of them, and I'll let them sit on the screen for a few seconds each one. So, or maybe I should make one comment. If it isn't clear, of the 42,500 such sites that I've mentioned in the beginning, each of the photographs you're seeing is one of those places. Okay. Let me see if I can't stop this sharing. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Really interesting about the technologies that you're using, the different cameras, this idea of the planes of focus that are brought out with the use of the earlier apparatus. I'm wondering also in terms of how you approach your art, like how do you find the sites where you're capturing these images? Some of them are pretty apparent, right? Like Baba Yar or the synagogue on the roadside between Kaunas and Vilnius. But I'm thinking of like some of the earlier images that you shared with the bus station in Poland, the construction site in Ukraine. You mentioned that you sometimes have focused upon places whose seeing is unreconciled with knowing. And I'm wondering if you can share a bit about how it is that you have in fact come to know, right? Like how do you structure your travels through these spaces and actually find the sites where you are, where you're working?
Well, there are a lot of resources. The research, the background research is very deep and extensive. Some of it is just available to anybody who really wants to take the trouble to find it. That is, Yizgar books are a major source of information. Videos, USC Showa videos, another important source of information. There are any number of town level or city level studies now that exist on about various locations. Some of them are very extensive, some of them are just passing. Sometimes the information comes by a single individual who, this is not published information, but so for example, the photograph of the construction site in Ivano-Frankivsk, there's still a small Jewish congregation there. And the rabbi Moshe Kolesnik is an amateur historian of his town. And he took me around and he showed me places, and then he drew me a map for other places that he didn't show me. And I never could have found those places. But I think that this landscape of knowledge is really approximate most of the time. Sometimes it's exact, but most of the time it's on a continuum between exact and really unverifiable altogether. And this this incomprehension or this unverifiability, I think, is a really important part of this kind of project. I think it's what makes this work distinct from the work that I did, say, at the Galicia Jewish Museum, which really was about presenting states of knowledge, documentary knowledge to audiences. This particular work, I think, tries to parry back and forth the effort to know and to understand with the constant encounter with not knowing, not understanding, not being able to verify the status of one's possession, one's mental possession or emotional possession of the past, and that difficulty of confirming to oneself the facts of the matter, even at a basic level, not to mention the meanings of the facts. This is what I want this project really to put on the table, in some contrast to what documentary work, including my own documentary work, conventionally wants to do, which is to give a viewer a sense of control over that which is seen or imagined. This work, I think, wants to move back and forth between that sense of control, but some other sense also, which is really the terms of the Holocaust itself. I think that's how I would call it, is if the Holocaust is present itself, it's present as a disruptive presence. It's present as a wrecking presence. And that presence should be that. I think it's only fair that an encounter with the genocide should include both kinds of approach. Whether I succeeded or not, I can't say, but you know, I think I'm clear that incomprehension is an extremely important element of this. And really in that sense, I feel like I'm following Hannah Arendt, that she's really my muse in that sense. Constantly sort of leading me back towards the honesty of admitting what's not known, or that sense of undecidability or unsayability, without reducing memory either to I mean, this is the real problem I think that we have, is the tendency to want to reduce that which is so difficult either to the side of a kind of a state of knowledge, which is an object for us, which we can grasp and learn, or something utterly ineffable, which is which is beyond us.
Mhm.
I think I resist reduction in both directions.
Yeah, and yet there's always some kind of a reaching for, right, or kind of a longing to have some control, at least over the way that we articulate what we imagine to be our own knowledge or understanding, right?
Yeah.
And I sense that in your work. And one of the things that as I've come to know your book, which was published, of course, in 2021, and I was coming to know this book against the backdrop of my knowledge of your work, which I had gained over the previous several years through a number of your online galleries. And I'm thinking in particular of the Jewish photoworks series and the European photoworks series, which seem, from my outsider's perspective, to be overlapping in some really important ways with the project of Alive and Destroyed. Yet they seem in some ways to be like playing with different ways of ordering what one takes to be one's knowledge, right, or one's understanding, and different ways of presenting. And so in the online galleries, many of the sections of the galleries are presented as tiles, which are often geographically labeled. And it sort of seems to me to encourage a certain kind of self-directed wandering through particular spaces across this broad geography where you're working. Whereas just the very structure of a bound book seems, on the other hand, to be encouraging or inviting the person with whom you're communicating through the medium of your book to work in sort of a linear fashion, right, from a beginning to an end. And yet your book is not clearly organized in any kind of particular geographical order that I've been able to discern, or even in terms of a chronology. And so I'm wondering if you can share a bit about what went into your process of the way you thought through taking this massive photographic material and these years and decades of travel behind it and turning it into a book form. And I guess more broadly than that, like how you think about these different ways of presenting and experiencing, traveling through this incredible body of work that you've created.
Well, that's a complicated question. I think there are many parts of it. For me, books are the sort of destination of most of my projects, and the reason is that it's in photography, as we know, there is no sort of ordained presentational form. There are many legitimate presentational forms of photographs. Sometimes they're on printed pages, sometimes they're on walls of galleries, or sometimes they're on screens, big ones and small ones. And unlike other forms of art, that variety is completely organic and legitimate to the medium of photography. I tend to migrate towards the book as the mode of delivery because I find it to be the most intimate and interactive and direct, and at the same time, the one that sustains the most personal kind of immersion. Unlike a screen, which is interactive, at least many screens are interactive, but I think they tend to sort of bias us towards a quick and sort of, scanning type of encounter rather than a more contemplative one, which is what I'm interested in. So the book is for me, the book is the way. It's not, it lacks certain things that exhibitions lack, and it lacks certain things that web galleries lack. Have it, these other forms have their own virtues, but in the case of putting together a bound book, as I think I was trying to suggest earlier, my approach to the topic is very decentralized. I don't think of the Holocaust as, I think there are very famous and notorious and centrifugal places in memory, but in my understanding of it, we have a vast number of places and situations and events that are more or less unranked in my reading of it. And I think that I follow contemporary scholarship in that sense of looking at the Holocaust from the perspective of localities, without being able to say that one of them comes before another one in significance. That's my general disposition. And so that sort of lends itself to a presentational form that privileges simultaneity. The sense that you could encounter this first or that first, or maybe your path goes this direction first or that other direction second. All of those things, the sense of openness is integral. You're right to say that when it comes to making a bound book, you have to put things in a certain order. And so in that sense, there's I worked on the sequence for years, and hopefully there's an internal poetical momentum that moves the sequence along. It's one sequence out of many, many sequences that could have existed. In the case of the online galleries, maybe I should just jump over there for a second and show people what you're talking about, Kevin. I did many projects on the way to doing Alive and Destroyed. And I had to learn many things in order to learn this topic. And so you'll see here, there are dozens of projects that I did in the decade. Some of them are site specific. Some of them are more roaming and integrative. Many of them involve combinations of texts and photographs. So just to give you one quick example, this is a case study that I did over about 10 years of time on one memorial project in the city of Lviv, which takes the form of an essay that keeps handing its meaning back and forth between images and texts. There are several such case studies that are here along the way. Like Alive and Destroyed, I don't know how to rank them. I don't know how to rank the order in which one would encounter them. And so in a certain way, all of these projects seem to me to have a kind of a part in a whole that exceeds any one of them, and that in fact exceeds me. And I don't see that there's any intellectual honesty that doesn't admit the primarily excessive quality of the subject itself. Now, why would an artist choose to devote time and life to a project that exceeds the ability to make, to know it or make work that somehow is commensurate to it? I don't know. That's a certain kind of artistic temperament, I guess. But yes, in my case, each one of these things represents a piece of a larger whole of searching and striving to know and to understand and to remember in one's own time. And I guess this question about in one's own time sits behind a lot of my motivations, because I think of myself and our moment as being sort of at the very beginning point in the long history to come that of inheriting the meaning of genocide, this particular genocide and other genocides. We are, my generation was born after the war, one of the first generations born after the war without direct experience. And that is the situation for everyone in the future forever. Ours is, so it seems to me that our generation has a certain responsibility to frame that problem, or attempt to frame the problem of remembering as well as we can. And to my way of thinking, a de-objectified approach to the problem of remembering is needed. We have plenty of what I think of as objectivist or objectifying modes of remembering the Holocaust that that we're surrounded by, and I think we have too few of them that that take a different approach, a more contemplative and unfinished, disconcluded approach.
Yeah, and speaking of remembering and the challenges of remembering, you write it in the introduction to Alive and Destroyed that the project had its origins in 2001, when you had a visit to your family's ancestral home in the Ukrainian village of Miena.
Yeah.
By my count, it seems that about a quarter of the images, so a full 18 out of 72 images in the book, by my count, are images that you captured in Ukraine. And I can say that as a historian who is working deeply within European spaces that often overlap with many in your own book, I can say that my own experience of your work has really been inflected and impacted in some really fundamental ways and challenging ways by our experience collectively of yet another recently unimaginable tragedy that's unfolding in these very spaces.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you are thinking about some of the spaces, the places that you have captured images of your book, the people with whom you've worked in these spaces, in light of everything that we're all reading and watching in the news. How are you grappling with your work and this project, which took shape in what now seems like a different age, a decade, 2 decades ago,
Suddenly.
in light of all that's happened since February?
Well, in a certain way, it's not a new issue for me because as I think I've, you and I've talked about in the past, I was living in Lviv in 2014 during the Maidan Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity. And at that moment, there was a lot of conversation that I was part of, even from that moment, about the place of Holocaust remembrance in the current in that conflict with Russia. And so the topic is, unfortunately familiar to me, at least in certain forms from that time. I don't know, Kevin, whether you were able to hear Timothy Snyder's talk a few weeks ago. And I was on that, I've read all of his books and I follow his work closely. And I thought he argued pretty persuasively that what we're looking at in the case of the current war in Ukraine is genocide. This was this is the word that he used. This is not an emphatic word, not a word that he was using to argue that this is just very terrible what's happening, but he actually meant it in a kind of technical sense, that we have the announcement that a state is illegitimate, followed by the effort to eviscerate its government and dissolve its existence. That's genocide. And now, I don't know, Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern, among other people, has sort of pushed back about this on this point and said that there's no comparison at this moment between what happened in the Second World War and what's happening in 2022. I mean, Ukrainians have a state, they have an army to protect them, they have a geography to protect them. The world opinion is on their side. This is completely different than what. and not to mention that not every Ukrainian is walking around with a with a target on their back. And so if he's right, then I suppose we can say that historically speaking, there's not yet a comparison between what happened then and what's happening now, but affectively there is one. And we feel a lot. I feel every day, I feel the resonance of history in the photographs and videos and reports and interviews that I read and so forth. I think that from a Jewish perspective, there's always a fear that the Holocaust is going to be overshadowed by something else, some next tragedy, some next crime. And part of that fear owes to the long experience of competitive victimhood in Eastern Europe. My hope, and I can only call it a hope because I don't really know what, I wouldn't say it's a likelihood at this point, but my hope is that the evolving democratic culture of Ukraine will open itself to historical remembrance of the country's Jewish people, not create a kind of bracket in which it's now somehow legitimate to speak about a ranking of miseries in time. I hope that that's the case. And I think there's a lot of evidence that the maturation of democratic culture in Ukraine does involve exactly that. But of course, it also involves really complicated and difficult topics, especially having to do with Ukrainian collaboration during the Holocaust and the Ukrainian nationalist movement's fascist roots. So it's a very complicated and difficult situation. But I guess my hope is that a democratic political culture will not forget the deeper miseries that have occurred on Ukraine, what's today Ukrainian territory, and that's Jewish misery, but not only Jewish. We can't forget Polish and Roma Sinti and others.
Yeah, thank you. I think as we're just about ready to open this up to a broader question and answer with the audience, if I can ask one quick question at the end of our period, which is just that I sense that this project, which coalesced, again, as I said, in what feels now like another age, around 2001, and has now reached a point of culmination in 2021 with the publication of your book. I sense that this project is far from over. And I wonder if you just have a couple of words that you can share with us about where the project goes next and where you're going next as an artist.
Well, yes, I set this project as an open-ended one that I would do as long as I have mood and power, as they say in Ukraine. And I've worked in about 300 of those 42,000 places, rather deeply in 300 of them. I certainly have no shortage of work to do if I were to keep going with the project. I do want to exhibit the work. I want to bring the work to physical exhibition somewhere, and I have very concrete ideas about what it would look like as an exhibition. Of course, that's a whole other project, and requires its own funding and so forth and so forth. But yes, I will continue to work. The book is 118 photographs out of about 3,000. The archive at this point is about 3,000 4x5 photographs. And I don't know if I were to count the Leica photographs, I don't know, it's many, many thousands, tens of thousands of photographs. The whole is the entirety of it.
Can I ask you a question about that? Well, first, I'd like to, certainly open up the conversation. So if you're an audience member and you have a question, feel free to send it in through the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Could you imagine this project encompassing these sort of traumas unfolding before us? In other words, could the medium of photography have the capacity, perhaps, to exhibit the kind of layering, not just of a single event, but of these sort of multiple traumatic events?
Definitely. Although definitely, and I think that the broader work on my website is exactly that. It is exactly that kind of layering with different kinds of photographic approaches, different kinds of visual styles, different kinds of visual logics. Alive and Destroyed is a very particular kind of visual language. It's a very specific kind of visual language, and I'm a little reluctant to, I don't know, try to apply it. I have to think that problem through about the contemporary landscape of conflict. I'm a little bit reluctant to simply apply it that way. Maybe I don't know. I haven't worked that out.
Thanks. Okay, another question about the book itself, which strikingly is, of course, bookended by your own words, by you. But in something that really surprised me, there are no words on any of the opposite pages from these photographs. And you spoke about this a little bit, but I have a sense that it's possible that that choice has something to do with the difference between memory on one hand and remembrance on the other. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that distinction in your work, through your work, and maybe particularly as a reflection of a set of critiques that you're making of the ways that the Holocaust exists, right, in our contemporary, culturally exists in our contemporary world.
Yeah, well, when I originally started working on this book, it took me a long time to find the visual language for this project. I don't know of any other work out there in the world of photography that is thinking photographically quite like this work, and so I didn't have a model for it. And originally, I intended this book would be would join texts with photographs directly on every spread. And I actually wrote a lot of those texts. They were these mini essays that were to accompany the photographs. Some of them made it into the book in that long essay in the back of it. But at a certain point, I guess I realized that the texts were kind of weighting things too much on the side of knowing. And it was the editor actually at Daylight Books who made this clear to me, who said, this book should proceed as a sequence of images without invoking language next to them. The sites are available in the back of the book for those who really want to know where these places are. They can be found in the book, but I think that his suggestion was really correct in that the book, by delinking the image from a text, a caption, an essay, whatever, it provokes a kind of open-ended contemplative or meditational experience. And this is exactly in keeping with the question you're asking about remembrance and memory. Which I think of as two quite distinct things. I guess the language, the English language doesn't distinguish them all that carefully, but for me, I think of them as quite different. I think of memory as a static process, an objectifying process, a grasping process. And I think of remembrance as an experiential process, a de-objectifying process, and a fluid process. I think of memory also as very connected to nationalist projects and to instrumentalization of the past. And I think of remembrance as decoupled from instrumentalization. And in this sense, I think of my own project as very much a project about remembrance as against memory.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have a couple questions about knowing and seeing. One of our questions is, how can we know how to look, even what to look for, when we don't know what we are seeing? And of course, this has to, this is related to the relationship between what we might think of as knowing on one hand and seeing on the other. And I mean, this is maybe the most provocative question. Can we see something without knowing that we are seeing it?
Well, I think that the act of seeing is actually many acts that are not distinguished in language. I would, if I wanted to sort of separate them into parts, I think I would say that seeing begins with noticing. And from the point of noticing, it proceeds as a kind of scrutinizing of the surfaces, which then begets a kind of seeing into, or an emotional experience of seeing, which then gives way to, I don't know, what I think of as a kind of experience of seeing through things. But the most mysterious of all of them is to go from not noticing to noticing. Something which, and this is not particular only to the act of looking. I mean, I think all of us have had the experience of learning a word, a new word, and then suddenly hearing it around us all the time, and asking ourselves the question, well, why am I hearing this word? I didn't know this word until recently, and now I hear it all the time. And it's not that the word ceased to exist until that time. It's just that you didn't hear it until that moment, right? So I think that something like this is the case with seeing also, but I don't think that it's hitched to a kind of on-off switch of not knowing to knowing. I think that there's something fundamentally mysterious about learning to notice something, which arises often by an authentic process of discovery, which in which there's partial recognition of what one is in the presence of, or a sense of doubt and questioning that somehow arises in the midst of what was otherwise conventionalized looking, or a kind of taking things for granted, taking things at a certain surface value. And I think that there is a kind of wonder that's attached to that act of noticing. I don't know how to entirely explain how it happens, or why it happens, or where it happens. I do know that I've had the experience many, many times of being in the same places and not knowing things at one moment, and then knowing a little more later, and knowing a little more later. Sometimes I find out that what I knew was wrong, and that in fact something else was the case. It's a fluid state, this state of knowledge. It's not a static event. And so, I suppose, to restate it, the photographs I think it would be false to present a photographic account that rendered the act of knowing purely as an act of clarity and grasping, because that's really not what it's like.
Thank you. That was such a wonderful answer. And also maybe related to another question that's posed, particularly about how the dialogical or multi-plane focus nature of the photographs you take function to place viewers in a kind of liminal space where they have that sort of, I don't know, the experience of perhaps undergoing that process, right? That maybe in some ways repeating the process that of following in your footsteps that you've described. Could you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
Yeah, sure. I think that's exactly the point of speaking about a photograph as a contemplative experience, as not an object, but an event. And if the photograph is successful, it will sustain that sense of understanding and not understanding, that it will sustain some authentic sense of discovery. And instead of finishing that search off, it will somehow sustain it. At least, you know, and the challenge of the finding a visual language that will do that was really, really hard. There are all kinds of nuances. It turns out there are all kinds of nuances that, you know, some small thing will tip the balance too much in the side of not understanding, and some other small nuance will have the opposite effect. And yeah, the task of creating a set of visual terms to sustain a contemplative experience, that's hard. You know,
Yeah.
that sort of balance between information and poetics, or the quality of things and the fact of things, it's hard.
Okay, we have a couple questions, all of which are asking in a couple different ways about the function of national borders, or perhaps empires, the borders of empire as well. You know, in your work, as you're trying in some ways to decenter the Holocaust, and not, you know, create a ranking of these kinds of miseries, how do these boundaries function? Are there differences between landscapes, cultures of memorialization, contemporary attitudes towards Jews that make your work different in, say, Ukraine versus Poland versus Lithuania? And also a sort of related question about the ways in which, you know, these sets of questions aren't intended to allied, you know, Ukraine with past empires, but also to sort of note that you're using the language of Galicia to talk about some of your photographs and places that now sort of fall within what we would call Ukraine. Is the space of your work Jewish space, Nazi space, contemporary nation space, states? In other words, could you reflect a little bit on how these kinds of, you know, geographical boundaries, both of the present and of the past, you know, speak to each other?
Well, this
or not?
Yes, I can. And this question, on the level of research, there's an enormous amount of difference. You know, for example, Lithuania and Latvia have make Holocaust-related searching in situ research very, very easy, because there are databases that exist. You know, there are some 2,000 massacre sites in Lithuania, and every single one of them is documented on a website. It's geolocated with, you know, with a GPS marker. It's accompanied with historical pictures, interviews, you know, archival interviews, documents. It's all there. So if you want to find out where something happened, it's easy to find it in Lithuania, and same in Latvia. How that came about, there's an interesting story about how that database came about. It wasn't easy to make it come to exist, but it does exist. Nothing like that exists in Ukraine. In Poland, it's a patchwork of information that's, some of it is easy to find, some of it is hard to find. It's not centralized, but it's a little more centralized than it is in Ukraine. In Romania, it's really completely decentralized. It's hard to find it. So in this sense, yeah, national borders make a lot of difference in terms of the research. Then there's the question of cultures of remembering and forgetting, contemporary cultures of remembering and forgetting. And that topic is really at the heart of the work that I did for the Galicia Jewish Museum. Those questions are what those exhibitions are about. How the past is and is not understood today, who's working on it, what are they doing, what is the effect of different initiatives, mostly at the local level. All of those questions are there in those exhibitions. And those are not, those kinds of questions, those sociological questions are not what Alive and Destroyed is working on. I mean, those are for other projects. They're good questions, they're very important questions, but those are not the questions that are moving Alive and Destroyed. And so I would say that I have not sought to create a taxonomy, a national taxonomy of remembrance that these photographs from Alive and Destroyed are pitched to. But the thing is that I suppose, the overriding truth of it is that even in places where the most organized kinds of research have happened, the most organized kinds of presentations are available to people, these places are still, if you actually go out and travel, if you actually go to these places, you find something in common between them, whether they're in Lithuania or in Eastern Ukraine or in Hungary or other places. And that is that there's this sense of hauntedness about these places. There's this sense that something non-quantifiable is present to you when you go there. And I think that it's that dimension of encounter which Alive and Destroyed is really working on.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question. And of course, it's a big question. So, just enough
Good.
time to answer it.
Good.
Which is that somebody asked whether you could say more about the influence of Hannah Arendt's work on your thinking, particularly on your thinking about remembrances.
Yeah.
And if I could actually maybe elaborate this question just a bit, Hannah Arendt's influence on your thinking, and just anyone else photographers, writers, anyone else who has really kind of had a shaping effect on how you approach your work on this project.
Well, that is a really big topic. Hannah Arendt has been an important figure for me, and I think that this was true even from the very first work that I did going back to the 90s when I was in graduate school. I remember reading Hannah Arendt's comment that there is at this moment no such thing as thinking about Auschwitz. Rather, there is only thinking Auschwitz. And this comment that Auschwitz was not an object of thought. What she means by Auschwitz here is not just the place Auschwitz, but we're talking about the genocide or genocide. The fact that human beings have attempted to eradicate human life simply because it exists, purely because it exists, that once this has come into the world, we have no choice but to think in terms of it. There is no outside position from which we can sort of remove ourselves to entertain the idea that this is a possible thought. No, now this is a continuous thought. And the notion, this assertion that she makes, I think really runs through a lot of the reading that I did going forward, especially Giorgio Agamben's work on undecidability. It was really important for me, and I guess in general, trying to give a kind of vocabulary to the negative negative existence of this topic, the quality of nothing, of emptiness, of meaninglessness, of futility, of eradicatedness, trying to find a set of terms in which one cannot postulate these things, but maybe it's possible to encounter them. Maybe it's possible to enter into their midst in some way, some meaningful way. I couldn't I couldn't write about these things. I realized that. I could write around them, but I couldn't write about them. But maybe it was possible for me to find my way visually through this means, which is this quasi-lingual medium. I could find my way into the presence of that kind of insistent but fugitive dimension of meaning.
Oh, I'm muted, of course. Thank you so much. I think maybe we'll conclude, but Jason and Kevin, this has been just a wonderfully rich conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I want
Thank you
to
both.
remind everyone that the recording from tonight's event will be on the TAM Institute's YouTube channel in the coming days, and you can also expect to receive a follow-up email with Jason's contact information, and the information that's been in the chat about how to purchase a book will also be in that email. And Jason, congratulations, Mazel Tov, on the publication of this beautifully rich publication.
Thank you, and thank you both for a really nice evening. Really nice conversation, and to the participants also.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for your work.
Okay, good night. Good night.
Shall we sign off? This was wonderful. Thanks so much for doing this.